It's cold up in here. If you guys want to come sit over here in the front so you can actually see, instead of being at the side of my head, the people that are sitting right over there, you could totally move over there, then you could see. Hey, don't budge it, it's fine. I'm glad you're here. All right, here we go. How many of you like Stephen King? Oh yeah, put your hands down. I am a writer, and I know that about 1 to 2% of what goes through your head ever ends up on a piece of paper. I worry about Stephen King. Because if that's what got out of his head, what has he got roaming around in there? When my son was 10 years old, he wrote this story. I worry about my son the same way I worry about Stephen King. This story is not fit for man nor beast. It is without question one of the scariest ghost stories I tell, and I have my 10-year-old to thank for it. He wrote it on the way home from church one morning. We're Unitarians, perhaps that had something to do with it. So here we go. Have you ever known someone who's really, really controlling? Now, they want every ounce of you. Sometimes it's just a friend who gets really upset if you're with other friends. Sometimes, hopefully you haven't dated or married someone like this, because sometimes these people can be quite dangerous. My son doesn't actually know any people like this. How he came up with the story is sort of beyond me. The story is called The Lover's Promise. And I'm hoping we can forego the motorcycles while I'm telling it, but who knows? Now, Sarah was a beautiful young girl. From the time she was little, oh, she was just as sweet as pie. And she was so friendly and outgoing, and everybody loved her, and they gathered around her. She had so many friends, little boys, little girls. The grown-ups would just say, oh, she's so sweet. And there was another young man in that community. In that community, there was a little town, and they were up near the mountains and kind of cut off from everybody else. And in that community, there was a young man by the name of John, who was a few years older than she was. And John was the opposite of Sarah. Whereas Sarah was open and outgoing and loved everybody, John was kind of closed in on himself, and he only had one other friend, and his friend's name was Obadiah. My son was 10 when he wrote this. He thought Obadiah was a great name. Obadiah and John were together, and when John wasn't with Obadiah, he was trying to figure out how to play with Sarah. He was really sweet on her, and it was really obvious, and everyone thought it was just so cute, but they didn't think anything of it because everybody loved Sarah. And as they got a little older, John started looking at Sarah in a slightly different way. And her parents didn't worry because they thought, why would she be interested in him? She has so many friends, there's so many young men who are interested in her. Why would she be interested in him? And yet, isn't that just how it works sometimes? Opposites attract. And Sarah, outgoing and full of life, began stepping out with John. And back in those days, young people didn't go off by themselves, only they were in groups. And the groups of young people, they would go up into the mountains and they'd sort of walk around talking to each other. And John and Sarah would hang in the back and they would hold hands and they would talk about the future and life. And John and Sarah came up with a little poem. It went like this. One of them would say, "Do you love me? Do you love me?" And the other one would say, "Yes, I do. Yes, I do." And then together they would say, "Then down into the musty earth, I would follow you." Meaning if one of them died, the other one would die of a broken heart. They were very young. And they would walk around together holding hands and laughing. And even though, of course, there were lots of other people there, John liked Sarah to be with him. Years went by. John and Sarah looked like they would kind of try to make a match. which was making her parents very unhappy. But her father wasn't too upset because John was a poor boy from a very poor family. He didn't have anything to offer, and so her father wasn't over worried about it. But what he didn't count on was how determined John was to marry Sarah. He left school at 16. He'd been working with a carpenter for a few years. He apprenticed himself to this carpenter full-time and learned everything he could about building. And a year later, he went up into those mountains right around where they lived, and he found a prairie. And the best thing about this prairie was long and flat. The best thing about it was there was a little track that led up to it that you could only traverse with a horse and cart. And he figured in the winter it would be so slippery nobody could get up there and visit them. In the spring it'd be so muddy the horse cart would get bogged down. Nobody could get up there to visit them. Most of the summer it would be so dusty when you went up there nobody would want to come up and visit them. He figured maybe 1 or 2 months of the year it would be nice, and then he could only share her a little bit. The rest of the time he'd just have her to himself up there on that mountain. So he decided he was going to build her a house up on that little meadow, up on that horse cart. And he was actually working pretty hard at it, and it was kind of an interesting house. I'm sure most of you know what a shotgun house is, right? That's where you stand up and you can open the front door, you can see all the way through it, and usually there's a door at the back. But he wasn't skilled enough to try to put 2 doors in the house, plus he thought it might be a little drafty. So what he did was he made a really wide front porch for rocking chairs and such in the evening, and you'd be able to see beautiful sights because they were up in the mountains. And then when you came into the house, 2 big rooms in the front, totally open, no doors. One side would be the sitting room and one side would be the living room. And back in those days, the living room is where you lived. That's where you hung up. But the sitting room, a lot of times they laid people out in there. So after you died, there'd be a little table, they'd lay you out, someone would come up and get you all cleaned up and all fixed up, and then the people would come to the house and look at you for a little while, then they'd bury you out in the family plot. So there was this big sitting room up there, and then you went down the hall just a little ways, and there were 2 big alcoves, and he thought they could have more rocking chairs in there, and in the evening, when it was quiet, they could sit across from each other and sort of stare at each other and talk to each other. And in the back of the house, 2 big rooms. On one side for Sarah and John, it was going to be a really nice room, and the other side for all their children. And in the very back of that house, instead of putting another door, he put in a huge stove. He figured it'd be warm enough, it could warm the whole house since there weren't any doors. It's quite an undertaking for one person to be building. If he'd known better, he wouldn't have made it that big, but he'd only been apprenticed for 1 year. He didn't have any idea. And he worked at that thing and worked at that house and worked at that house for 2 years. Nobody even knew he was going up there doing it. And Sarah got closer and closer and closer to her 16th birthday. And he got it mostly the way he wanted it when he went to her father and said, "Come this spring, Sarah turns 16, I'd like to ask her to marry me." And her father said, "Well, John, where are you going to take her?" He said, "I'm glad you asked me that." And he took him up that track, and there was that house, mostly finished. And her father couldn't say no. And it actually was a really nice house. It was very sweet. Her father said, "All right, John, you can marry her." And as soon as word went out that she was getting married, people started getting excited. There was a little town, they didn't have a lot of weddings. This was the first one they'd had in a while. And everybody was very excited. And they started sewing her wedding dress. And everyone started thinking about what they were going to give the new couple. And they wove curtains for them. And someone carved them a beautiful bedstead. And all that winter, even the winter seemed to be excited about that wedding because it kept itself calm. And they could go up and down that track almost every day, working on that house. All the men in town, sawing, cutting, plastering, painting, nailing, doing what they could to get that house ready. And at the very end of winter, Sarah, she was turning 16, and John said to her, "I'm going to go up to the house and finish a few things off. I know it's not perfect, but we're going to get married in our house. So on your birthday, you get everyone together and you coming up and we're going to get married in this house." And she said, "All right, John." Well, sometimes at the tail end of winter going into spring, snowstorms hit the mountains that nobody saw coming. And they woke up in the morning and there was a thick layer of snow and ice on that track. And they realized that higher up in the mountains, where John was up in an empty house, there was snow. And they tried to get up there to him, but that track was just too treacherous. And they said, you can't go up there, but I'm sure in a couple of days the snow will melt and you can get up there. Because that's what normally happens at the very end. You get some snow, it melts, it's a little muddy, but you can do it. Not this time. That snow held on for a week and brought its own self down the mountain and even made the streets icy. No one was going up that track. It was almost 7 days before they got up there. The men wanted to go up by themselves, but Sarah said, no, we're going to get married in that house. He said we were going to get married in the house. You bring all of my things. You bring the curtains, bring everything. We're going to go up there. We're getting married in that house. And so nobody could stop her. Nobody wanted her to go up there by themselves. They loaded up the carts and they got up that dangerous track. And when they got up to the mountains, they realized something was wrong. The front door of that house was open and there was snow coming out of it. They called for him, he didn't answer, and they found him in the back of the house. They figured that he must have gotten sick and feverish and started seeing things and hallucinating, because what he had done was gone into the room that was supposed to be for him and Sarah, opened one of those windows and just sat underneath it. He'd been dead for days. Sarah was distraught. And they wanted to take John back down the mountain and bury him in the churchyard. And she said, no, he wanted us to live in this house and we are going to stay in this house. I'm going to live in this house and you bury him in the ground right next to it. And they tried to talk her out of it, but she would not hear it. And so despite what they all wanted, they loaded her things in that house. They got pickaxes and shovels and they dug a grave in the frozen ground and they put John in it. She didn't want anyone to stay with her, not even her mother. She sent everyone home. She put on her wedding gown. She went out and she knelt by that grave. And she put her hands on the dirt. She said, do I love you? Yes, I do. And down into this frozen earth, I will follow you. And she waited to die. She waited for a week. Then 2 weeks, then a month. But she was really young. She was really healthy. There was no reason for her to die. People would come up and down that track trying to get her to eat stuff. They'd put things in her house. She wouldn't talk to anybody. That wedding dress got ragged and dirty. Her hair turned into a big rat's nest. She was weeping all the time and sitting by that grave. People would come up and they would just watch her with her hands in the dirt. Do I love you? Yes, I do. And down into this musty earth, I will follow you. That went on and on until the day Obadiah came up the mountain, John's only other friend. And Obadiah saw her there in that dirty wedding gown. He looked terrible himself. And he said, don't get up. I just noticed that Don never quite finished these windows, and I know he wouldn't want you to live in this house like this. I'm going to take care of it. And he started fixing her windows. Now, it is rude if somebody is working on your house, if you sit outside in a dirty wedding dress. So he got up. She got herself all cleaned up, got her clothes on, did what she could with her hair, and she offered him some lunch. And the two of them sat at the table, and for the very first time, there was someone else who understood about John, who really knew him, and the two of them sat at that table, crying and talking, and she finally got to mourn and wail it out, and he left that afternoon, and he came back the next day. Obadiah said, I think John would have wanted you to have window boxes. And he put window boxes on all her windows, and she invited them, they had lunch, and today they cried and cried, and then they stopped crying and they started talking. And he left and came back the next day. He said, I think John would have wanted you to have flowers in these flower boxes. And so he planted beautiful flowers all around in her flower boxes, and they set the table and they ate, and they didn't cry very much at all that day. They talked, they laughed, they had a good time, and he left and came back the next day. Obadiah found a reason to come up that mountain almost every single day. Now, John had really successfully isolated Sarah. She really didn't see much of her old friends, but Obadiah convinced her to come down the mountain and spend a little time at her parents' house. And when she did that, she started waking up again. Her life was coming back. They went up and down that mountain all the rest of the spring. They went up and down to the mountain all the rest of that summer. And at one point when they went up there, Obadiah brought some long white boards and made himself a nice fence around that grave with a gate in it. And he said, the dead are in the ground, the living are in the house. I think maybe it's time for them to stay apart. And before the summer was over, everybody knew there really was going to be a wedding, because Obadiah and Sarah had fallen in love. And when he asked if she would marry him, she said yes. And her father said, yes, yes. Please bring her back down off that mountain. We will build you a house. Just get her off the mountain. As soon as the yeses were all done, the men started working overtime building a house down there. Well, it was quite done as the fall was coming in and the leaves were falling. And everyone charged up the mountain and they started loading all of her things into the cart. And Sarah stood on her porch and she turned around and looked over at that grave. She hadn't been over there in a while. It was dried leaves everywhere. She said to Obadiah, she said, you know what? I have to stay here one last night and say goodbye to John proper. And Obadiah said, all right, honey, you come down in the morning. She said, I will. And so, as the sun was going down, she got her broom, swept out that house until it was so clean, wiped all that beautiful wood down. And as the sun was really sinking, and the sunset was painting the sky, she went out to that grave, she opened the gate. She went in there, slammed behind her. She got down on her hands and knees, she cleared the leaves away, and she said, John, I know I said I was gonna die when you died, but I'm alive and I'm in love with Obadiah. He's like your brother. I know you want us both to be happy. We're gonna get married and we're gonna name our first child after you, John. And the wind began to blow through the grass on that grave. And she could swear she heard his voice. It said, do you love me? Do you love me? And she just laughed. She said, John, you know I do. And the wind blew through the grass again. And then he said, then from beneath the musty earth, I will come for you. She stood up. She brushed off her knees. And she heard him again. Do you love me? Do you love me? She didn't answer. She backed up to the gate. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And down below the musty earth, I will carry you. She opened the gate. She walked out it. She slammed it. She went down the path. I am hearing things. I'm hearing things. This is crazy and crazy. My brain is playing tricks on me. Oh my gosh, maybe I just feel a little guilty. This is not happening. This is not happening. She went up the front steps. She closed the door. She started thinking that maybe she was just tired. And this was a lot. She was changing her life. She did something she'd never done before. She threw the bolt on that door. This is crazy. In her house, she felt very safe. And then she heard. Someone had opened the gate, and it shut behind them. Sarah went to the back of that house, by that big stove. She crouched down on the floor, pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her fingers around them, interlaced her hands, and listened as she heard something was coming down the front wall. She made herself as small as she could as something came up the front steps. Such a beating on the front door. The door splintered inwards. The bolt embedded itself above her head. And she looked up. And standing in the doorway was a silhouette. And she could see the full moon over its shoulder. And the wind began to blow into the house, and she could smell an open grave. Do you love me? Do you love me? And she realized something. If she could get that thing to come into the house, maybe she could get around it. Because of the way the house was situated, if he came in far enough, she figured she could use that alcove where their rocking chairs were, and she could go around him and get out of the house. If he came in and she jumped too soon, he would be too close to the front door and he could grab her. If she waited too long, he'd move through that alcove and she'd be pinned in the back of the house. But if she timed it right, she could go around him where their rocking chairs used to be and get out the front door, and he wouldn't have ability to catch her if she could get around him. So very quietly she stood up and she said, yes, John, I love you. Come on in. He came over the threshold. Do you love me? You know I do, John. Come on in. He got a little closer. Yes, you do. She didn't have to turn around, she went out the door. He grabbed her skirt and ripped the fabric. She didn't stop. She went out the front door. She went down the front steps. She hit the front lawn, hit the top of that path, and started running for all she was worth in the dark. But as fast as she could run, she could feel him breathing on her neck. And she could hear, do you love me? Yes, you do. And down into the musty earth, I'll carry you. She ran down that path. She ran as fast as she could in the moonlight. Do you love me? Yes, I do. From beneath the musty earth, I have come for you. Ah! She fell off the path, rolled down in an embankment, and just lay there waiting to die. Nothing happened. She opened her eyes, and above her head, the full moon filled the sky. She could feel cool wind on her face, soft grass beneath her. And she just started laughing. She said, I'm going crazy. I'm dreaming awake. This isn't possible. I am fine. She could even see the road up there from down the embankment. She said, there's nobody up there. This is ridiculous. And she got up. Now, it is not safe in the mountains to get off the path. Anyone who's ever been in the mountains knows that as you walk, the shadows play tricks on you. And occasionally you think there's solid ground in front of you, and it's really just a drop. It's not safe to get off the path, but she wasn't particularly sure she was safe staying on the path. So she followed that embankment. It had a little meadow, and it was actually going down, and she was able to stay on it for quite some time. And the longer she stayed on it, the more ridiculous it became. I mean, she was perfectly fine. But then, the road and the meadow met up, and she considered it. And then she looked between the trees and she realized she was almost out of the mountains. She could see not too far below her lights from the first houses of the town. She'd come almost all the way out. For a moment, for just a moment, she thought about trying to stay through going through the trees, but the whole problem of getting too far from the road is if you fall and hurt yourself, nobody will know where to look for you. So she got back up on the road. And she started walking. And nothing happened. Nothing at all. And she breathed one of those amazing sighs of relief when she realized she was almost out. And she took a turn right around the last bend. She could see the end of the path in front of her, and the wind raced by her face, and she could smell an open grave. Do you love me? No! Something grabbed her arm. First thing in the morning, they were waiting for her to come out of the mountains, and she did not come. Obadiah was beside himself. He thought, I hope she's okay. I hope she's not changing her mind. But after a little while, he thought, I should check on her. And he started up the path, and he came around that bend, and he started finding pieces of her. Hanks of her hair hanging in the trees. Bits of her dress. At one point, she had dug her fingernails into the path and had been pulled. She had gouged a big trench in the ground and lost 3 of her nails. All the way at the top of that path, Obadiah was calling for her, hoping that maybe she was okay. Hoping that even if she was very badly damaged, maybe she'd been caught by a creature, a mountain lion, something. But the very first thing they saw was a bloody handprint on the gate. And when they ran over to the grave, 3 of her fingers were sticking out of the ground. Those are the only 3 she had left on that hand. And they tried to get her up, and she would not come out. And so they began to dig, to move the dirt away. And when they finally got down to the coffin, they realized why they could not get her out of the ground. John had punched through the top of his coffin, and he had her firmly by the ankle. Well, pried her hands, with his hands loose, pulled her out of the ground and reburied him and called for the priest and blessed 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 and blessed. And then they took her back down the mountain. Obadiah was overcome with grief, and he wanted to have her buried next to his house. And they said, no. And they put her in the churchyard where she belongs. And they say that if you go to that little town and position yourself just right at the foot of that path, you get amazing cross breezes, and if there is a full moon and the wind is howling just a little bit, down the mountain you will hear a voice, and it will say, do you love me? Do you love me? And if you wait long enough, you'll hear a wind from the graveyard. No. And that is the story of the lover's promise. My son said to me, can it have a funny ending? I said, we can do that. It's your story, whatever you like. I hope that you were willing to take pieces of us home with you. All of us have CDs out in the table, and we actually have our ghost stories on them. So scare yourselves silly and enjoy it. Thank you for coming out and making so great event tonight.